Sorry about the delay and sorry about the technical difficulties. I've never done that before, but I think it's finally working. So welcome everyone. We're so glad you're here with us tonight. I'm Lucy Helfrich from the 300 Committee Land Trust. First of all, I hope that everyone has been getting out this winter to enjoy nature and the many trails and special places that help boost our physical, emotional, and spiritual health over the last year especially. I think we've all realized how important this is. We're really, really happy to have you here tonight with us for Mike Tucker's talk, Owls of New England. Before I introduce Mike, who I know is familiar to many of you, I have just a few comments. We'd like you all to be muted and hope you'll stay muted throughout the talk and save your questions until the end. When Mike is finished, if you have a question, please use Zoom's chat feature and type it in. We will definitely be saving time for questions and hope to get to most of them. Now, about the 300 Committee, for those of you who don't know, since 1985, which is now 36 years, the 300 Committee has worked to preserve more than 2,500 acres throughout Falmouth. We are always working on new land acquisitions for permanent conservation. And in fact, just today, we added just over 3 acres to our conservation holdings in North Falmouth with a land donation from the Mahler family. And this is really exciting news. I just wanted to share that. We believe that our work makes a real difference in shaping the character of Falmouth now and for the future. We work to save special places all over town for conservation, water protection, plant and animal habitat, and special places where we all can walk, run, canoe and kayak, snowshoe, cross-country ski, watch birds, enjoy beautiful vistas, revel in nature, and enjoy the fresh air. If you are not yet a member, please consider joining us. Membership support is critical to our work. It enables us to continue to save important land in Falmouth, to manage and steward the lands we protect, and to provide outreach and educational programming like this talk and the many walks that take place throughout the year. If you'd like to make a membership gift, you can do that right from our website, 300committee.org. Thank you. And now, a few notes about our speaker, Mike Tucker. Mike teamed up with the 300 Committee about actually going on 4 years ago, I think. And right away, he became an important volunteer and resource, especially when it comes to birds. Indeed, we know he has developed a huge fan club, and for good reason. A true outdoor enthusiast, Mike is a skilled photographer who loves to share his knowledge about the natural world and especially birds. His passion for birds began more than 40 years ago with his first pair of binoculars. Mike's background includes career and volunteer experiences that span a wide range of field biology and education. He has led birdwatching trips all over the Northeast and continues to give talks and teach workshops. Many of us have joined him on local bird walks, which are always informative and fun. Stay tuned to your inbox for 300 Committee news about upcoming dates for Mike's Migration Mondays, taking place on early mornings in April. This birdwalk series will be a great chance to see and hear many species of birds that migrate through Falmouth in the spring. Mike has some additional walks planned for other days as well. Tonight, Mike brings us his knowledge, expertise, and beautiful photos as he shares information on owls, many of which abound right here in Falmouth. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mike Tucker. Mike.
Thank you. Well, yeah, it's nice to offer this program again. And as we can tell by the numbers, everybody loves owls. And so tonight we're going to take a closer look at a wide variety of aspects that make them so fascinating. We're certainly going to delve into the physiology of them a little bit, and then look at the individual species, how they relate to us around here, where we can find them, habitat, that sort of stuff. And we'll cover a wide range of things, but rather than talk about what it's going to be about, I will just get into it and we will actually get rolling with the program now. And thank you everybody for joining. Why isn't it? Oh, okay. Technical difficulties here. Here we go. All right. Well, one of the first things I usually like to cover is really what makes them so unique, and the physiology of these birds, and you know, just the special adaptations they have that make them true hunting machines. This is a close-up of a great horned owl. It was a captive bird I used to use for educational purposes back in my Audubon Society Rhode Island days. and always a showstopper. Actually, I don't think I ever shared this story before. This particular owl, I was doing a live piece on Channel 10 News in the morning, and I had it on my glove on my arm, and I didn't have the little jesses, the little straps in my hand quite tight enough. And as I'm talking, it walked off my glove up onto my forearm a little bit, and it was quite painful. But he didn't know any better. Love these birds, and we're going to learn a little bit more about them. I got some arrows pointing to different things here, but I'm going to be talking all about that here shortly. First thing I want to talk about is the hearing of owls. It's extremely unique in the bird world, and the medulla part of the brain that basically controls all the neurons for hearing is so much more well developed than other birds. A barn owl especially has, they say, 3 times as many neurons in that part of the brain than an American crow, for example. And all of these owls we're going to look at tonight have a very highly developed sense of hearing that in that part of their brain is extremely well developed. If you look at the skull on the left, I believe that looks like a northern saw-whet owl skull. You're going to notice that the openings on the side of the head in the temporal region are, somebody's not muted. I could kind of hear that coming over my speaker. Anyway, so one ear is designed to point up and one ear is designed to kind of point down, which is really strange if you think about it. Ours are pretty much symmetrical for the most part, and we hear equally, out of each ear. But what happens here, the left side is usually a little higher, and it detects sound either above or below the sight line. And when it does that, it can kind of figure out, where that sound is. It basically hones in almost like, a 3-point between the hearing and the eyesight, and the left, right, up, down. They can pinpoint exactly where that sound is coming from, and they can make adjustments in mid-flight. So if they're flying along and that little mouse is squeaking or rustling in the leaves and move,
Michael, you're muted. Michael, you are muted.
You are muted, Mike.
Mike, you're muted.
okay, how long did that happen? From the beginning?
A minute.
That's weird.
You're fine now. Yep.
Huh.
Fine now.
So all of a sudden it just kind of went out on me. I didn't
Yeah.
touch anything. That's weird. Okay. All right. Well, I was talking about the asymmetrical hearing, the asymmetrical skull and the ear canals of an owl. And basically they can detect which sound, left or right, that it enters first. And they can align their head. If it enters one ear before the other, they can align their head so it's coming in at an equal amount of time. So they can make adjustments based on that millisecond difference of when it reaches the left side or the right side. And what they can do is move their head up and down and also figure out what's right in front of them. And they can pinpoint left, right, up, down, and keep that right in front of them. And that all ties together with what we're going to be talking about next with the owls, which is their eyesight. Now, keep in mind that they are hearing things right in front of them, and they're always able to pinpoint exactly where that's coming from. And the reason why that's so important is because the design of their eyes is pretty unique as well. First of all, their eyes are very large for the size of the body. In fact, there are certain species of owls where the weight of the eyes compromise about 5% of an owl's body weight. So that would be equivalent to me basically having 10-pound eyes. It's really crazy how big they are for the size of them. But that is one of the features that really helps them be an incredible hunting machine, as I mentioned earlier. Before I get into the left graphic there, I want to talk a little bit about the biology of the eye a little bit. they aren't round like ours are mostly round. They're actually more tube-like in shape. And that sits in this scleral sort of bone cavity, they call it. It's like a tube that surrounds the eye. So they can't move side to side. They can't move up and down. Their eyes are fixed forward all the time. And within that eyeball, there's a lot of differences there as well compared to us and other birds as well. They have far more rods than cones. And, that's basically referring to the cell shape of the light receptors in the eye. And the rods are more designed for picking up movement, contrast in light and dark areas. So it's having that really helps them pick up on things at night in terms of slight movements, picking up slight tonal differences with just the starlights or the moonlight, if that's all they have to go by. And they're lacking the cones, or they have very few. So seeing color isn't really that important to them. So that's why they are really adept at seeing in low light situations. An owl, no animal could see in complete darkness. And that's kind of a myth that people will toss around with owls, that they can see in darkness. You need some amount of light. And that's what an owl is really good at doing, is just using that very minimal amount of light that enters their eye. And because they see so well at night, there's also a little myth that owls have a hard time seeing in the daytime. It's difficult for them. That's why they just go sit up in a tree and close their eyes. And that's not really true either, because their iris can control the amount of light that comes in. That being said, if you see an owl at night, you don't want to shine a flashlight on their face directly. You don't want, because they don't have the ability to close that iris quick enough to adjust. So it can be a little bothersome for them if you do that. So be aware of that. I mentioned that their eyes face straight forward, and that is key for what we call binocular vision. That's what we have. We see binocular vision in about 140-degree plane. They see it a little bit more narrow at 70, but that allows them to see in 3 dimensions. They can gauge distance, they can gauge size, the depth of something, and that's a really helpful tool for them. So when they are flying and they're adjusting their head and moving their head around, listening, they're always seeing where the sound is coming from. So it all kind of ties together. So basically that little mouse doesn't stand a chance. These guys are really designed perfectly for grabbing mice under leaf litter. If you ever seen video of great gray owls actually flying over a snow-covered ground, they'll just rear up and dump right down through the snow without even seeing it, because they hear that mouse underneath the snow. It's really incredible how they do this. Hold on, I got a little glitch on my screen here right now. I don't know if all right. All right, I will go on to the next slide here. And again, we're going to tie a lot of this together shortly. Now, their feet are very unusual as well, in that they're feathered all the way down to the toes. And that certainly helps them with temperature regulation. But a lot of those feathers are actually specialized, and in certain parts of the feet, they have these little stiff feathers that act as feelers. And they also have those around the bill as well. And it gives them a feeling of a sense of touch, whether it's with their prey or something that they're trying to investigate. So it's basically the way they can kind of detect subtle differences and textures and skin tones, whether it's a rock or flesh or what have you. Those highly specialized feathers give them the sort of sense of touch that we have with our fingertips. Excuse me. This outside toe that you see in the back swivels forward, but more often than not, this is the arrangement that you see. You see 2 forward and 2 back. And that's a fun, fancy word called zygodactyl toe arrangement. And owls, roadrunners, cuckoos, there's a few species that have that. And all of the owls that we see around here have that as well. And that's really a helpful tool for them in grab and prey as well. So when they're flying along and they hear that mouse in the leaves and their eyeballs are fixed right on it, again, they make these adjustments in flight, so it's always right in front of their face. And because of that, their face goes right to the sound. So they throw their feet up last second, right in front of their face, usually when they grab that mouse. So, everything is just basically tunnel vision to what they need to get. And all the tools they have is designed to help them get that. You've probably heard that owls fly silently. It's not really about how they fly so much as it is the structure of their wings. The flight of an owl, the wing beat isn't all that different from other raptors, but the structure of the feathers are quite different. On the leading edge of the wing, they have these little flutings, and you can see the close-up down below. And what that does, typically a bird without that flapping through the wind, you could hear the gush of the wind going over the wing. But with these flutings, it breaks down that wind into little micro turbulences, and you really can't hear it. And I've witnessed this. I've been around owls. I've had them flapping right next to my head, and it's true. You really can't hear it. It's pretty incredible tool that they have. You think about all these things and that come into play, all these adaptations they have, and they really are quite unique and remarkable in the bird world. So they eat a wide variety of things, and some of them specialize in just mice. Some of them specialize in, insects like eastern screech owl. During the summertime, they grab a lot of moths around lights. They'll even grab large insects that are crawling up larvae up trees, those sort of things. But of course, they grab mice as well. Occasionally, they'll take a small bird roosting in a tree nearby. Barred owls have been known to take a lot of amphibians and reptiles from time to time. So it all depends on what species you're talking about. But they certainly are good at what they do. And this is just a little example of some of the variety they have. Talk a little bit about the digestion of owls and how they digest food, which is also unusual in the bird world. All other birds have a crop, and owls do not. So their stomach is divided into two parts. And when they swallow food, usually whole, like a mouse or a meadow vole, like this great gray owl has, it's going to go into the first part of the stomach, excuse me, called the proventriculus. And that part of the stomach is where the digestion begins. That's where a lot of the acid and the enzymes and the mucus start breaking up the animal that is sitting in their belly. And eventually that passes through into the second part of the stomach called the ventriculus. The ventriculus is where all of the softer materials start to pass through, but it's like the trap, it's like the screen. It's where all the bones are collected, the undigestible, the undigestible stuff like the beak and the feet and the bones all kind of gather up in that part of the stomach. And eventually it forms a pellet within that stomach, and it pushes it out into the first part of the stomach. And then maybe 10 hours or so later, the pellet comes out. And that's what you see here. So all the owls regurgitate pellets, and most birds of prey actually do as well. It's just a little bit different with owls and how they do it. But it's funny when you see them do it, and I've seen them do it a number of times. You would think that it's coughed up, or there's a little bit of hacking involved, or they just have to push it out as an effort, but that's not really the case. Usually they lean forward, they'll have this strange look on their face, they just open their mouth and plop, it just comes out. There's no real effort to it at all. It's not strenuous for them in any way. But it's a regular thing. And if you're looking around trees and you see a favorite roost, that's often where you will find the pellets, or vice versa. You find pellets, you found the favorite roost. So sometimes they may not necessarily eat from that spot, but it's where they go to rest. They go to just kind of wait until, they go out for another little hunting trip. And sometimes you'll find where they roost in the daytime as well. It's usually a dense cover, evergreens, thickets, those sort of places. If they don't have a natural cavity to roost in like some of the species do. They'll find some of these places with a lot of cover. They don't like to be in the wide open. Start talking about some of the individual species a little bit here. Eastern screech owl is a tiny little guy, only 8.5 inches high. Well, what's beautiful about this little bird is that they are very prolific. They aren't too picky about habitat. They'll nest in a wide variety of habitats, certainly even urban areas, abandoned warehouses they've been known to nest in, downtown areas with street lights everywhere. In fact, they'll even flourish around places with streetlights, and sometimes they'll go out of their way to hunt near streetlights because of some of the activity at night attracted to those lights, like the moths I mentioned earlier. You notice here, you see two different color phases. I just said phase, and I was just going to preach how you're not supposed to say phase, and then I just slipped right into it myself. They're called color morphs. Phase is a term that refers to something that's temporary, and it's a morphological difference between the gray and the red. It doesn't change, it's just the way they are. And we could see equal numbers around here. I've had both nesting in my yard, actually. You know, one doesn't necessarily have to find the same color morph. They can interbreed. It's the same species. Both of these birds here were actually rescued birds. I used to be on a list when I was in Rhode Island for rescuing birds of prey because a lot of us at Audubon handled them all the time. So we would get the calls from the rehabilitators or different organizations. So the one on the left was my neighbor's, actually. It was in his chimney. And that was a bit of a messy job. I was absolutely covered in ash and soot trying to get it up because it was sitting on the little flue bar that went across the chimney. And eventually I got it, but I knew it wouldn't be able to fly back out. The problem is once they get into a chimney, they have a pretty significant wingspan. And despite their small size, so there's no way they're going to be able to flap out of there. So they just kind of fall down through until they settle somewhere. But the one on the left was a little bit easier, that's for sure. It was in a neighborhood in North Providence, and I grabbed all my stuff, went rushing over there as fast as I could. As I pulled up in the driveway, there's all kinds of friends and neighbors out on the front lawn sipping drinks. They're like, oh, smiling, come on in. And I walk in the house and it's just sitting on a fireplace log behind a screen, calm as anything. Everybody's just taking pictures and staring at it. But I didn't want to release it in the same neighborhood because I was afraid the same exact thing would happen. There wasn't a lot of trees. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for it to find a safe place to roost. So I took it to one of our wildlife refuges and I put it on that branch. It just sat there for a little photo session, and eventually it flew off on its own, and it was a good ending. But they are a cute little bird, and they're very vocal. I've actually had mine around here calling in the daytime lately once in a while. Natural cavities are always a beautiful thing for them to nest in, but a lot of times the neighborhood you're in, or trees fall down, storms, natural cavities start to disappear, and there's also a lot of competition from other species for these natural cavities, whether it's mammals or birds. So they're not always easy to come across, and they're not always big enough. You know, sometimes the tree might just bust over the cavity, and they don't like being in the open like that. So nest boxes end up working out pretty well for these birds, and they take to them pretty easily. This was actually in a cemetery in Rhode Island, and it was funny when I took the picture on the left, it just seemed to kind of slowly keep coming up like it was on an elevator until it filled up the hole. I got a series of other shots where you could see at the different stages as it was creeping up in the hole there. You could see that their range is basically all of the eastern United States. It had its cousin, the western screech owl, basically takes over for the western part of the country. And why it's a separate species, I'm not entirely clear. I guess DNA tells us that, but boy, there really isn't a big difference there. You know, there's difference in the vocalizations and some other things there, but they look pretty darn close. So there were several birds one day making a ruckus by my house in a stand of bamboo, and eventually I saw a screech owl in there. So I thought, well, let me put up a box. And within 2 weeks, it was in the box. And then springtime came. There's mama and the baby poking the head out. So they really do take to it pretty easily. If you're lucky enough to have one around, you put up a box, they're at least going to investigate it. And you always have a good shot of them nesting in it. And I should probably take that opportunity to talk a little bit about what's going on here. This is a basic one board design for an eastern screech owl box. It's also used by American kestrel. A northern saw-whet owl might use a box like that as well. But some of you on this program are probably aware, about a month or so ago, on the wildlife group here in Falmouth Facebook group, I mentioned I'm going to be starting a nest box project, not just for American kestrel and screech owls, but bluebirds, great crested flycatcher, that sort of stuff. And I put the word out, said if anybody wants to donate wood or money towards wood, I'm going to be working with local conservation groups, private landowners, municipal land, that sort of stuff. And it was overwhelming. I think to date, we're probably up around $1,800 or $1,900. Lots of boxes already made, lots of wood. It's an ongoing project. And it's just basically going to be a good resource for the 300 Community Land Trust. If they're like, hey, we need some new bluebird boxes on a property, I got you. You know, new kestrel box, I'll take care of it. So I ended up having to set up a separate account, tracking everything, and it's been a nice project. At the end, I'll have my email address, and if anybody wants to be involved with that project, just shoot me an email and let me know. Barred owl is another one that we have nesting around here. They do pretty well. As the forests have matured on Cape Cod, especially this end of the Cape, the western end of the Cape, we've been seeing more and more barred owls showing up. You know, interior Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and other parts of New England, they've always done really well. But their numbers are starting to grow here on Cape Cod. There aren't too many out in the outer Cape. You know, you get out towards Barnstable area, a lot of the forested areas start shrinking and getting a little smaller. The trees are a little younger. You don't quite see as many. But they are around here, and we've done some owl walks for the 300 Community Land Trust, and one day we had one fly right up to the whole group, which was pretty exciting to see. The barred owls have a pretty significant territory, 200 to 400 acres, it says here, but you know, those are always variable too. It all depends on the situation they're in, the amount of suitable habitat around them. Sometimes it's smaller, sometimes it's larger. In rural areas, a lot of these habitats are on the larger side of what I mentioned here on some of these. But they have a very unique call, which I didn't do the screech owl call. But the words that people often put to the barred owl call is who cooks for you all. My throat's a little dry, but I'm going to try to do it a little bit here. It's kind of like this. Something like that anyway. And they're very loud. They do a lot of variations of that. They're extremely vocal. And in the springtime, now and then you'll just hear one belt out a call in the middle of a May walk going through the woods. And it's like, whoa, where'd that come from? You can see they're all dark eyes. They're just beautiful, beautiful birds. They're usually nocturnal, but these birds have been known to fly around once in a while in the woods, sometimes hunting in the daytime. Their habitat is often associated with open woodlands near water sometimes, swampy areas, but it can be dry open woodlands as well, but they seem to favor those sort of lowland areas with open woodlands and large trees. 2 to 3, the larger the birds, usually the numbers start to go down a little bit and how many they have in a clutch. And these guys are starting to nest now. They're very territorial. Usually by the end of February, early March, they're actually on a nest, but certainly territorial behavior is happening right now. And I didn't mention that with the eastern screech owl. We're kind of in that territorial stage right now. Usually by the end of March, they're nesting. But with the barred owls, it's a little bit sooner than those, and not sooner. And the excuse me, I'm having a little bit of allergy issue tonight. I apologize. But the barred owls, excuse me. You probably can't see the glitch I'm having on my screen, and I apologize for this. This is something keeps popping up here. I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of it. Anyway, so that's the barred owl. And if anybody has any questions about those, we can talk about those later. They are cavity nesters if they can, but unfortunately we don't have a whole lot of trees around here big enough for them. So what barred owls do is that they'll take over the nest of a crow, a red-shouldered hawk, something like that. And they don't add anything to the nest. And the screech owl we looked at earlier, they don't add anything to the nest either. It's a hole in a tree, a hole in a box, they go in it, it's good enough for them. They're not bringing sticks to it, they're not lining it. And barred owls may line it a little bit, but they're not constructing a nest at all. In fact, many years ago, there was a barred owl nest in Rhode Island that blew down in a storm, and the young weren't quite ready to fledge yet. So with the help of the fire department, a few of us put together a makeshift nest that was basically a heavy-duty laundry basket. And we lined it with sticks. We put the young ones in it. The fire department helped us get it up in the tree, and Mama took right back to the nest and took care of the young, and they fledged. So it all worked out. Great horned owls, the granddaddy of the owls around here, kind of the top of the avian predator food chain. You don't mess with great horned owls if you're other birds. And when they show up on a nest, then they decide that's my nest, then that's their nest. The nice part about these owls are they're choosing nests when the hawks aren't nesting yet. So, you know, if the hawk has a strong fidelity for that nest site, they show up and the great horned owls there, they're like, oh, well, I guess we need to go build a new one, because they'll stake claim and that's it. I found a couple of nests last year, and usually white pine trees, if they're available, they love them because of the dense cover of all the boughs around them. They're not usually at the very top of the tree. They're usually kind of a little bit lower underneath the crown, which red-shouldered hawks will typically do, crows will typically do. So something like an osprey nest that's out in the open, they'll take once in a while. I've certainly seen great horned owls nesting on ospreys, but usually in those pine trees, those old hawk nests, they really seem to love those. You can see their territory size is rather large, 1/4 square mile up to 5 square miles. And when we're hearing them in November, and I had a lot of people say this, mention this to me, that they've been hearing great horned owls in November and even into early December, the thought is that it's courtship. At that time, that's not really the case. What you're likely hearing are competing males where the territories sort of overlap or come close to each other. Because that time of year, the females and males aren't calling back a whole lot until they start really courting and actually getting on the nest area and honing into the nest site, which I've been hearing here lately. And when you hear the great horned owls call, you know that male and female are calling back and forth, because the female actually has the higher pitched voice and the male has the deeper voice. That being said, these birds, like almost all the owls and many birds of prey, are sexually dimorphic in size, meaning that the female is actually larger than the male. So despite being the larger size, the female still has the higher pitched voice. The male has a larger voice box actually with the great horned owls. So 1 to 4 eggs on the great horned owls. These 2 pictures here, this bird on the left is one of those 2, were the nest fell down, and this was last year here in Falmouth. And Kevin Friel and myself went out there and tried to make sure they were okay when we realized the nest came down. And we found this guy on the left and another one just at eye level staring at us, and they seemed perfectly fine. They were able to do short flights, which is typical when they first fledge. They start branching out, which is what you see here on the right. This was before the nest came down. They call that branching, aptly named. So that's usually the first stage. And then next thing you know, they're starting to spread their wings out, do short little flights to other branches. And a lot of times those first attempts at flight end up on the ground, and that's typical. They aren't necessarily injured when that happens, and they usually, from fear and wanting to get into a safe place, are kind of driven to flap those wings a little bit more. And that's true with all birds. That's a lot of songbirds end up on the ground at first, but they really work hard at trying to get to safety, and that's kind of what drives them to learn how to fly better and faster. Barn owls are extremely unique. They're in their own family altogether. All the owls we've seen so far in the family, the subfamily called Strigidae, and the barn owls, on the other hand, let's see. The barn owls are Titanidae, and they're unique in a lot of ways. Their eyes aren't proportionally as large as the other owls, but their hearing is more adept. They have more of a heart-shaped facial disc, where all the other owls we look at today have more of a round sort of or oval facial disc. And their ear openings are more round and more pronounced and very large. Even structurally with the skeleton, if you looked at the skeleton in terms of the way the ribs structure is, they're so different in many different ways. Excuse me. And this bird on the left here was actually nesting in a barn that we learned of in Middletown, Rhode Island. And for a number of years, we went out there to band the young. And that one is actually a recently fledged bird that we're able to get a hold of, and we did get bands on it. They do pretty well. Usually mom will kind of fly up in a rafter and sit there while we're taking care of the bird banding. And the one on the right was another box that we were visiting in South Kingstown, Rhode Island, where we had a successful nest. And we would take turns kind of going up and doing some maintenance on the box now and then. So if one was going up to clean the box out and do some maintenance on it, the other one would wait outside with the camera. And that's what I was doing with this one. So we opened the box from the inside of the barn, and it flew out, and I managed to get kind of a lucky shot of a barn owl in flight. They have a hideous, hideous sound that just sounds like a blood-curdling screech. And it sounds like it's straight out of a horror movie. They can find mice across a pasture. Their hearing is really in another league compared to all the owls hear very well, but the barn owls are in another league altogether. Although the great gray owl is also pretty darn good as well. Unfortunately, the barn owls numbers are declining drastically. The nest box project that I was working on with my old teacher mentor, I'm not even sure if any of those locations have barn owls anymore. They nest on Martha's Vineyard. They're not believed to be nesting anywhere on the Cape. Historically, there has been some places across Massachusetts. Not sure if they're holding on anymore either. They're highly susceptible to bad winters, and sometimes they just don't make it. They'll try to find stands of evergreens to go roost in sometimes in the winter. So they've taken a big hit. Nobody's entirely sure why. Block Island, Rhode Island, there's still a few hanging on out there. And out there, they'll actually they'll nest into burrows and cliffs where rocks and boulders have fallen out. So they'll go inside these bluffs and actually make a nest in a hole where a rock fell or a boulder fell out of down off the bluff. And this was definitely a few years ago when I didn't have gray whiskers and I actually had hair on my head. Look at that. Anyway. There I am with the unenviable job of cleaning out the box from the back, because once you open that box, the ammonia smell with the wind, you create that draft, all of a sudden it blows right in your face. It's not fun, but it's in the end, it's all worth it. You could see their worldwide range there. That indicates where they occur, not necessarily how common they are. And they really aren't doing so well through much of that range. A lot of that is due to loss of habitat. Certainly on its northern extremes, like I mentioned around here, weather can come into play, cold winters killing them off and those sort of things. But the farmland in North America, especially eastern North America, has disappeared at a fast rate. And that's really their habitat. Pastures, farms, barns, those sort of things. And there just isn't many around anymore. Northern saw-whet owl is a fascinating little bird. They're pretty tiny. They're smaller than a screech owl even. In fact, they are the smallest North American raptor weight-wise. But what we've never realized until fairly recently, in the late 90s, a banding program really got going with these guys. And it started in Pennsylvania and it kind of spread out through eastern United States. And the idea was to try to learn a little bit more about these birds because they were extremely nocturnal, meaning that you're just not going to really see them roosting in the daytime. You're not going to hear them in the daytime. They'll seasonally, it was believed that they were seasonally migrating, but nobody really knew to what extent. So a banding program started where they actually play recordings of these birds, and they'll drop out of the sky when they hear others calling, and they'll land down into some trees and they'll move towards the recording. and get caught up in the mist nets. And then they would ban them, they would take down information, and sometimes they would add some geo little transmitters and learn about their movement. And what they've learned about these owls is, one, there are way more than we realized. In fact, this initial banding station in Pennsylvania has basically 3 substations around it. And since the late 90s, they've banded over 18,000 northern saw-whet owls. Some nights, on busy nights, they'll get like 50 to 100. Nobody had a clue. They're so secretive, they're silent when they fly at night. And so they started basically going to all these different locations around the Northeast. And I know a couple of places in Rhode Island and Massachusetts where they've done really well finding these guys in migration. They don't always truly migrate. They're not really sure why. A lot of times the movement of birds that are unpredictable with their migration can point to food supply and coinciding with how successful they were that year. So sometimes if you get a bumper crop of northern saw-whet owls, and sometimes that even points to how well the cone crop did up north, because a lot of the rodents feed on the pine cones and the spruce cones when there's an abundance of those. And when you have an abundance of those, you get a population boom of those rodents, which in turn means high success for the northern saw-whet owls as well. So there's been correlations made with that. Every 5 or 6 years or so, there'll be a big push of them. There's always numbers coming through, but sometimes there's a really large push of them, and it's not regular. It seems to be about every 5 or 6 years we see those large numbers moving through. Interesting little behavior that these guys also do is that they will cache their food in the wintertime, and they'll go stick it somewhere when they want it. It's like basically pulling it out of the freezer, and then they'll brood down on top of it and kind of thaw it out. So it's just basically pulling something out of the freezer, letting it thaw, and then snacking on it. Most owls don't do that sort of thing, but these little guys do. Several years ago, I started an American kestrel nest box program in Rhode Island, where I was working with landowners and conservation groups. And I had dozens and dozens put all around the state. And it got back to me later that I didn't have a lot of success with American kestrel. I had a few that were used. But I learned that one of my kestrel boxes had nesting saw-whet owls and that actually fledged babies. So that was pretty exciting. And Peter Green was nice enough to give me the pictures that he got of that. I went there after I learned about it, but I wasn't lucky enough to see the saw-whet owl poking its head out like that. Short-eared owls might be one of my favorites. I mean, I know I say that about a lot of birds, but they're pretty spectacular. Among the owls, they are certainly animated, a lot of fun to watch, because sometimes they'll put on a show in the middle of the daytime. Technically, they're nocturnal birds, and usually they are more active at night. And certainly what we call crepuscular, that time just before sunset and just after sunrise, where it's still, you know, that range where maybe the sun sets, but it's still a little light out. These guys love hunting around that time. But food will often dictate when you see them flying around. So you go up to around Plum Island on the North Shore of Mass and some other areas, you'll often see them hunting in the middle of the day. And that probably is a direct correlation to when the food that they're grabbing, when they are active. So they just take advantage of that. And so you're going to find them in some of these barrier beach areas, large fields, meadows, usually coastal areas. When they move down in the wintertime, we see them. But there are some interior places that have good habitat as well. Certainly Middleborough, Cumberland Farms in Middleborough is a great spot. Not the convenience store, it's an actual conservation land. But there's a lot of them out there. And some of the agricultural fields and fallow sort of large fields near the coast in southern Rhode Island are other good places. And there's been one around there that people have been seeing. This was up around Plum Island last year. I haven't quite talked about, well, I haven't talked about birding ethics yet, but I'm going to wait for a particular owl when we talk about that. But it certainly falls true for all owls, because there's a sad story regarding this little guy as well. But back to this bird here, they're incredibly animated. And when they are flying around a field sometimes, late in the day around sunset and there's a northern harrier around, they love harassing northern harriers. So you'll see these little battles in the air. Sometimes you'll see two of these battling back and forth, and they do these vocalizations that sound like barks. And so they'll be barking at one another. They'll be, doing this kind of zigzagging flight, going on each other's tail. It's just a blast to watch if you ever get that opportunity. When they fly, it's this really strange mechanical sort of wing beat, intermittent with their glides, and it's almost moth-like with the way they fly. There's buoyancy to them, despite the mechanical sort of wing beat that they have that seems very rigid, but yet they seem very buoyant. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's a very unique flight that they have, and it's just a spectacular bird. Incidentally, I should mention, these birds have nested in Massachusetts. Historically, there were a few places, and then that started to shrink. And if they are holding on any longer, the only place they are believed to nest is on Tuckernut Island off of Nantucket, and which would basically be the extreme southern range of them nesting. Certainly south of us, they do not nest. Long-eared owl taxonomically is very closely related to the short-eared owl, despite the one having really short tufts and the other having long tufts. Usually the long-eared owl in flight looks very similar to a short-eared owl in terms of shape, structure, but the coloration's a little different. Sometimes their territory will overlap in the winter where they're hanging out. But you can see that deep sort of russet look around the facial disc that a long-eared owl has. And those tufts of feathers that have nothing to do with the ears, they just call them ear tufts, will often stick straight up and they'll elongate their body to look like a trunk of a tree. So they can make themselves very difficult to see. They'll roost in thickets when they show up. Sometimes they'll go into a large spruce tree, and there'll be communal roosters as well. So if you find one long-eared owl, look around because you may see others. I could think of a place, an old Mass Audubon property years ago, where I was walking along a trail and I saw actually this very short-eared owl, long-eared owl. This is an old slide from, God, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. And as it turned out, there was 6 of them in there. That was the only one I was able to get a shot of. So they're communal, and they're not really true migrants, but some of the areas north of us, especially the ones on the more northern, extreme northern range, will routinely move further south. And like a lot of owl species, we don't always know exactly what we're going to get, what factors come into play, why we see lots of them, and sometimes we just don't see any, and they're really hard to come by. But there has been 1 or 2 around in Massachusetts this year, and one of them has some ugly stories attached to it, and I will get to that when I talk about the old morals and ethics shortly. Which snowy owl is always a good time to talk about that. But we'll talk a little bit about the owl first of all. A friend of mine, Kevin Friel, took this photo. Just a spectacular shot he got down in Middletown, Rhode Island. It was hanging around Satchewest Point. This particular owl, I was a little angry at. Yes, I said I was angry at an owl. And the reason being because it was a very atypical bird in terms of behavior and the way it acted around people. So it kind of gave a lot of people the wrong idea on how to behave around these owls because of what this particular owl allowed. But I should mention a couple of things about them. So they breed up in the Arctic tundra, and we never really know for sure what we are going to get from winter to winter when they come down. But keep in mind, they aren't like a songbird, a passerine, that certain warblers will almost double in weight before they, head to the tropics. The neotropical migrants always go to the tropics. They always put lots of fat on. They always fatten up and put on a lot of weight. But when snowy owls show up, it's a different story. There are a number of circumstances that lead to them showing up here. It could be a very productive season that they had with a lot of young fledging. And when that happens, the adults, once winter sets in, will drive off the young ones because they don't want that competition for the food. So when there's a lot of young snowy owls around, and it was a very successful year, those are the years we see a lot of immature birds show up. The ones that aren't quite as gleaming white as the adults. They might have a lot of dark markings on them. And when that happens, you need to understand that those birds didn't plan on leaving. They leave hungry and they get here even more hungry. And every winter, there are dead snowy owls found. Sometimes they show up partially emaciated. They're very stressed. It's not always easy for them to make that journey and then settle in and find plenty of food for themselves. And of course, plenty of them do quite well. But sometimes it's tough for them. And in all cases, you need to keep in mind the stress level that we put on them and what that can mean for their survival. This is the same owl that showed up in Falmouth. These two pictures on the right, we know it's the same owl because of some key markings on it, and there was actually a splash of color on one of its wings that I don't think we can see in any of these photos, and I'm not really sure what that came from. The story behind this owl was it was a rehabbed bird. I forget where it was rehabbed. It might have been somewhere up in southern Canada. So it became very acclimated to people and being around people is very comfortable. At Satchel Point in Middletown, it was diving down right at the feet of people, practically picking up food. And I said I wasn't happy about this bird because that's really not the behavior of people were pushing the limits because this owl didn't seem to bother, which was probably true. But I never, ever, ever want to put that idea across to people. If the bird doesn't seem like it's being bothered, then it's not, because I try to drive this home all the time. The object of wildlife photography or observing wildlife is not to get as close as you possibly can. Basically, that owl doesn't want to fly. You think to yourself, oh, I was able to get 10 feet closer. Look at that, it's not flying yet. Look, I can get another 10 feet closer. Next thing you know, people are like 30 feet from this bird and it's not flying, so they think it's fine. The reality is that bird's heart rate is racing, which means it's burning valuable energy, which means it's extremely stressed. Stress is one of the biggest leading causes of death for birds, believe it or not, especially birds that are injured, that are taken into captivity. The stress of the situation, the stress of being handled is often what kills them before the injury actually kills them. I mentioned that short-eared owl earlier. This year has been a year full of horror stories with people pushing the limits, selfish behavior. There was a short-eared owl that was sitting on the ground that a group of photographers kept getting closer and closer to. They wanted to get pictures of it. And of course, they got as close as they possibly could before the short-eared owl couldn't take it anymore. It bursted off into flight and hit some power lines above it. It was caught up in the power lines. They were able to retrieve it. It was taken to Tufts, and it had to get put down because of its injuries. And that was all because there was people being selfish to want to get that photo. And you just need to put the bird first. You really can't think like that. And there's another story. This one was involved me and what I witnessed. I was leading a van trip up to the North Shore of Massachusetts, and we ended the day at Salisbury Beach. Somebody said, hey, there's a saw-whet owl roosting in the patch of pines by the campground over there. In the distance, I saw a bunch of cars over there. We pull up, and there's a whole crowd of people with their cameras out, including one man walking up to the tree and hitting the branch that the bird was sitting on with a stick so the bird would open its eyes for a photo. And yeah, I let loose on everybody there. And I'm wearing my Audubon jacket and I'm in an Audubon van, and yeah, it was no holds barred. I let everybody have it. I tried not to swear, but I basically told everybody how I felt about that and how selfish they all were for doing that and how inconsiderate they were for the wildlife. And it was just one of the most worst displays that I've ever seen. And I was a little nervous, but everybody in the van afterwards was thanking me about speaking up like that. And I tell people all the time, if you see that sort of behavior, speak up. I feel like if I don't, I'm being complicit. I can't turn the cheek and walk away. I was at Plum Island and I saw a guy kept making a snowy owl fly. It kept trying to land on the beach, and he kept walking close. It would fly, it would fly, it would fly. I stopped at the guard shack, told the federal the federal guy working the gate there, and basically he had a few people come in and have a word with him. I don't know, they probably didn't arrest him, but hopefully they find him. But anyway, that stuff happens all the time. You need to give them their distance. They easily get stressed, and look for behavior. If the bird is exhibiting certain behavior, you know you're probably aggravating it. If it's dropping its head, if it's lifting its head high, if it's leaning forward, like it wants to take off, it's uncomfortable, it's antsy, it's moving around, back off. Just don't even go near it. Just turn around and go the other way. Anyway, so that's a snowy owl. I don't mean to be all doom and gloom, but people really need to be aware that these birds show up in rough shape sometimes, and they just think they're there for their pleasure, like they're just going to pose for them. But you need to understand what's going on with them. Boreal owl is something that we don't see a whole lot of around here. Even when they show up in northern New England, it's a big deal because they're so difficult to see. They nest in dense conifers and difficult to find. Certainly throughout the boreal forest of Canada is where they do well. There are records of them nesting in Maine, but I don't think they do all that well up there. When they show up, it's usually a pretty big deal. Every now and then they'll show up in an odd spot, like sitting in a park tree in Boston or something like that. And people just come from all over and photograph it while it's just sitting there. And I could never get myself to join those crowds like that. I'd rather just come across one myself. But you know, I get it. People love seeing these birds. They're not very big. They're a little bit bigger. Well, almost twice as much as a northern saw-whet owl, but they look very similar at first glance. But they have a lot more spots on the forehead, and it's kind of hard to see here, but they have more of a gray facial disc outlined with black. You can catch a little bit of that there. But tough bird to see. In fact, I've only ever had one in my whole lifetime. So give you an idea. Whoops. And the great gray owl, we certainly don't get those here in Cape Cod, but every now and then they show up in northern New England. They're massive birds. I mean, they just, 27 inches high is a really large bird. So they're larger in terms of length than a great horned owl. They're larger than a snowy owl in terms of wingspan and length, but they aren't really the largest because that 38.4 ounces, the snowy owl and great horned owl are actually both heavier than this bird. But their facial disc is just huge. It's like a giant parabolic dish. And these are the ones I was talking about earlier that could fly over a snow-covered field and just drop down and grab something out of the snow without even seeing it because of that huge parabolic facial disc that they have. What they can also do in flight, and all the owls can do this, is they have really good, strong kind of facial muscles that can control the feathers and redirect sound. So they can move it around, they can open it up more, they can kind of curve it to one direction or the other, however they need to try to figure out exactly where that is. They're good at doing that. Just another shot a friend of mine got. I think he got this up in Canada, actually. Spectacular looking bird. Northern hawk owl, I won't spend much time on this. They're called a hawk owl because, well, they act like hawks. They have a much smaller facial disc, and probably because they're really diurnal. They hunt around like hawks. They perch out in the open like hawks. They don't rely on hearing as much as the other birds do. They certainly hunt by sight and will pursue things on the wing. They'll drop down on rodents they'll hunt from a perch like a red-tailed hawk or a red-shouldered hawk will do by sight. So yeah, these are fast, swift moving birds. Their wings are more narrow. In every aspect of the term hawk owl, they really are very hawk-like in nature, structure, and behavior. And that is all I have for now. I will probably put out word on a couple of other talks that will be coming up. As Lucy mentioned earlier, there will be some bird walks. There will be a couple more Zoom talks probably scheduled between here and towards the end of spring as well. And if anybody has any questions, we can certainly check the chat section. And there is my email. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me anytime. You can also inquire about that nest box program that I'm doing here in town. And yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining in. And how do I find the chats? Lucy, can I hear you
Yep.
yet?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. One of the questions came in early on. Oh, do you have to clean out nesting boxes every year? This is from Richard Smith.
No, not really. If we're talking about owls, owls aren't really fussy. I'll open them up because they're easy enough. They're on my property. I'll check them out. But in nature, screech owls are notoriously dirty housekeepers. They'll defecate in the cavity, in the hole. They'll drop pellets in there. I mean, it's just a mess, usually with screech owls. When I do clean them out, and I suggested this to somebody earlier this week who sent me a similar question, they said they had one box, they had two in their yard, and one box of squirrels made a nest. And I basically said, this is the time of year you want to open that box and just pull out all those leaves and sticks. There's a good chance that the squirrels will be deterred that you did that and not return, but now's the time of year when you can expect screech owls to be investigating nest cavities. So if you have that opportunity to clean stuff like that out, absolutely do it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Okay. We have a comment from Carolyn Newman, who just had a little story to share. I had the opportunity to watch a red-tailed hawk defend its juvenile against a great horned owl in my yard at Marston's Mill.
Wow.
The crows followed the show around the neighborhood, acting as the noisy peanut gallery. I'm sure that was a sight.
Yeah. That's I didn't get into it too much, but the behavior of birds is often the way I find owls. Not just the large owls. Everybody's familiar with crows mobbing great horned owls. They'll do it with barred owls as well. But the smaller birds like blue jays and chickadees and titmice, they'll make a racket. And we hear like a lot of different species of birds doing alarm calls like that. They got something, and it's worth investigating. And I found screech owls, I found northern saw-whet owls, just based on bird behavior alone. I had no clue in a few of these cases that there was even an owl there if it wasn't for the birds basically giving it away.
Great. Okay, the next, are there any good Falmouth Instagram or photo pages? Thanks for the great presentation.
Well, yes. There. I'm not sure. I've been really slacking on my Instagram stuff, so I haven't been on there lately. But I'm sure there's a lot of local people on that probably do hashtags so you can kind of, do Falmouth, this, that, and the other, and find stuff. But the Facebook group that I started a while ago started off as Falmouth Birds, but I switched it to Falmouth Wildlife. Is I don't know, about 3,400 people now. It's very active. We get photos of wildlife there every day. A lot of good information is shared there. So it's a really good, ended up being more of a great resource, as well as just a fun page for people to post things. There have been some great projects that have come out of that page. There's a lot of very knowledgeable people on that page that can chime in with different areas of expertise to answer questions. And it's a really good group.
Great, thank you. Next question. Thank you for a great presentation, Mike. This is from Nigel and Sue Roberts. Is it too late to put up an owl box for this year?
No. Well, first of all, I should say it's never really too late. And the reason being that sometimes, if you have a successful year in general in the area of screech owls, you're going to have a lot of screech owls around. And, it may or may not be birds that are paired up in mating, but all of these birds will always use a cavity. They don't use the cavities just for breeding season. In fact, 3 years ago, not long after I moved here, when I discovered the screech owl on the property here, I didn't get the box up until mid-March. And by the end of March, they were using it. So, technically this is like a territorial time for them. So they should be around. They probably have a box they were interested in. But my thinking when I put that box up, it's like, hey, they're not nesting just yet. Maybe this box is actually better than where they're considering nesting. And I don't know if that's exactly what happened, but they ended up using it. You know, I wouldn't even hesitate to put a box up in June because, hey, it's up, you know.
Right.
Again, non-breeding birds, birds that aren't attached yet, immature birds that maybe take a year or two to breed, they'll find boxes like this and it could end up turning into a nesting situation if it doesn't right away. So yeah, never hesitate. Absolutely.
Great. Do we have time for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Okay. This is from Joel Zaborowski, I think is the last name. I've heard it said saw-whet owls don't usually nest anywhere in Massachusetts. Besides that kestrel box you mentioned, how often have you encountered breeding saw-whet owls in Mass?
Well, I know that they've actually nested on the Cape, believe it or not. And I believe it's been in areas further out on the Cape, surprisingly, where there were thickets, maybe like dense thickets behind some dunes. See, typically, like an ideal saw-whet owl habitat, you usually think of dense evergreens, usually kind of a lowland area that's also near water, and that's kind of typical. And where they nested in Rhode Island, it was that general sort of habitat. Another place in Rhode Island I know was more indicative of what you would expect to see up north in some of the northern, New England forests with hemlocks and large pines mixed in with some spruce and some deciduous as well. But I'm not entirely sure. I looked into records of them on the Cape, and I know there's a number of them that have actually nested on the Cape. Not a lot, but it's such a secretive bird. Who knows? It's hard to say. They are very secretive. And in fact, many years ago, if I get if people need to leave, sorry, story time. But I was hiking a property in northwestern Rhode Island. It was in the middle of the day. It was a winter day. It was cold. It was sunny, blue sky. And as I'm walking through this area, I looked around and I thought, God, this just looks ideal for northern saw-whet owl. And I started vocalizing myself, whistling a saw-whet owl call. And I walked away thinking, what was I thinking? They're so nocturnal. As I'm walking away, one started calling back. And this was a day that before I carried a cell phone on me everywhere I went, and I didn't have a camera around my neck. But I followed the call. I'm like, where is this guy? Sounds like he's pretty close. Next thing I know, I'm staring at him at eye level in a branch 20 feet away from me. And as I walked away, he started calling again, like, come back. That was one of the coolest owl experiences I've ever had. I'll never forget it. But so they're around.
That's
Sorry,
cool.
long story.
Great. Okay, two more.
Yep, sure.
I have squirrels in my nest box. Any thoughts on what to do to get them out? Just removing the nesting materials?
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate. I haven't had a big problem here with them, and I know they can be a big problem. Sometimes selecting a tree that it isn't easy for them to get to, and then it's kind of ugly, but putting flash in at the base of the tree so they can't get over it. If you really wanted to try that, it has worked. I mean, I did something similar for a bald eagle nest, the first one nesting in Rhode Island, where they were nesting in this large pine tree on an island in Situate. And I went out there with a federal biologist, and we put up probably 6 feet of flash, and so Fisher and other stuff couldn't get up into that nest. And I've seen other people do it underneath a barred owl nest, and it worked. But if you have crisscrossing branches and everything's connecting the canopy, putting flashing up around a tree isn't going to help. But certainly cleaning that box out and just trying to deter them. Sometimes doing it over and over again will make the squirrel kind of change its mind on using that spot because it feels like it's just not going to work for them.
Right.
So sometimes you just got to be diligent.
Okay. Thank you. Well, this is actually the next question is two questions.
Okay.
About screech owls. How big should a nest box be for a screech owl? And that's from Michaela. And
Yep.
then Carly asked, can you please do a screech owl call?
My throat is dry, but I'll try that one first. Hold on. Hold on. I'm having a hard time. My throat is so dry, but
Try it.
With my phone, I will just pull it up really quick because I'm pretty good at finding this. And I have an app that will have the, yeah, my throat is really dry, so I can't, it sounds gross, but you kind of need a gargle, you spit and whistle at the same time to do a screech owl call. They have a couple of main ones. They have what's called a monotone sort of trill, and then they have a whinny call. And here's the monotone trill. And then here's the whinny call. Yeah, they're fun to hear. There's no doubt about it. They're also sexually dimorphic in size, and you can tell a male from a female. It's easier to tell the size difference with the larger birds, but the voice you can tell with the screech owl, generally speaking. As far as a nest box goes for eastern screech owl, you know, the face of it is usually around, oh, I don't know, 12 to 14 inches or so. The diameter of the hole needs to be 3 inches. And you want to get that box at least 15 feet up in the air, ideally. I've done a little lower when I haven't had a choice, but I try to get them up at least 15 feet. The book will tell you facing south to southwest. Anywhere in that range between south and west is ideal because they like facing the morning sun in the morning. That was redundant. They like facing the morning sun. But if the yard doesn't dictate a tree that will work for that, for instance, the very first box I put up on this property is facing north. And a lot of people tell you, oh, no, don't do that. But everything about the yard, the layout, where it was, just seemed like it would work, and it did. You know, you want it facing a clearing. You don't want any branches crisscrossing in front of the hole. You don't want any branches right underneath the box coming out. Yeah, I mean, just get it up and give it a shot.
Great. All right. Well, I think that will do it for tonight. Mike, thank you so much. Terrific, of course, phenomenal photographs, tons of great information. We really, really appreciate your doing this for us. And thanks to
thank
everybody
you.
who came tonight. Nice snowy night to be in and learning about owls. Take care, everyone, and we'll hopefully catch you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, start share.